All right, so now that we've built out this beautiful scene, we got our lighting in place, the next thing we want to do is we want to share it with the world. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and render out an image of the scene that we can then take out of Maya. We can post it anywhere we want, social media, send it to your mom, whatever you feel like doing. Before we do that though, let's talk a bit about rendering, what it is and why we care. So when we talk about rendering, rendering is the process of going from Maya to anything else. So this can go into an image, it can go into a video. Long story short though, this is how we get out of Maya something visual, okay? So this is important because it's going to be how we essentially produce our content. It's a bit different for the video game industry because what you ultimately do is you export assets which go into game engines. But when it comes to just portfolio work, which is producing images of what you make and actual animations, rendering is going to be the exit stage from Maya. Now, what's important to understand is there are two types of renderers in Maya. There is a CPU render and there is a GPU renderer. CPU stands for Central Processing Unit, and it's basically using your entire computer to produce an image. This is very powerful, and it's how we create cinematic shots. So it's how you create something realistic. The software that is utilized in Maya is Arnold. So Arnold is going to be how we produce a CPU render. And we're going to take a look at Arnold as we progress through this course, but we're not going to start with Arnold. I like to start out with the hardware render to get the basics down for you. And another reason is because it's actually what I use for most of my work working in the game industry. So when presenting game art, it's not ideal to use a CPU renderer because they are capable of so much more than what game engines are. Game engines have gotten to be very amazing, but they still cannot hold up to a CPU render. So with the GPU render, what we're going to start with is Hardware 2.0, and this is going to give us a nice look at how basic rendering tools work. So what's the trade-off between CPU and GPU? Why would you not want to have an amazing cinematic style shot? Well, the answer is time. The central processing unit, because it's using your computer's entirety to crunch the super complex formula, it can take a very long time to render. The longest time I've rendered a single frame for on my own personal project was about 72 hours, just past 3 days, I think. So that's the reason we're not starting there. Amazing pieces of art take an amazing amount of time to render. Now with GPU though, it's instantaneous. And that's the reason why I want to start there. You poke the button and it makes the image for you. So that's the advantage to GPU. You don't get as amazing of renders, but you get them instantly. So it's a great way for us to kind of just see how the process works and get on to our next more exciting and more complex project. So let's hop into Maya and let's kick things off by taking a look at the render settings. The first thing we have to do is we have to change our render setting to be operating with the GPU-based render. Interesting feature added in Maya 2023 that I was not aware of is the renderer you have set in your settings is going to determine what render view pops up. So you need to change this beforehand, or else when your render view pops up, it's going to give you Arnold because that's what it's on by default. Now you can access the render settings with this icon here. It looks like a slate with a little gear next to it. So that is going to be what we're doing there. You could also come to the rendering menu and you could come to render to access render settings as well. But my preference is to just come here because it's a lot faster than going into that menu. When you open this, it's going to open up the render settings panel. And this is going to be where we can determine what's rendered and how it's rendered and what it's rendered with. So you'll see the render using. We want to switch this from Arnold Renderer to Hardware 2.0. So click that little drop down, find Hardware 2.0 and click on that. When you do, notice your menus are going to change. The Common tab stays the same. The Common tab is going to determine what we're getting out of here. So whether or not we're producing an image or whether or not we're producing an image sequence, that's going to be determined at the Common setting. Also the size. So while we're here, we can go ahead and scroll down this bar here to access the size. You'll see right now it's only 960 by 540. That's pretty small. If we want something that looks a bit nicer, we can come down here and we can change that. You'll see that we have a preset here for HD 540, and this dropdown allows us to quickly change this to be optimized for different resolutions. Inside of here, you'll see a lot of options, but we're just going to scroll down a ways and you're going to want to grab HD 1080. This is the same as HD 1080p if you're talking about video resolution, 1920 by 1080. So it's basically our modern HD standard. So if you go ahead and click that, you're good to go. It's going to make a nice, big, pretty render. Now from there, let's go ahead and leave our render settings up. I'm just going to move them off to the side and let's open our render view. The render view is how we can preview what our renders are, and it's also how we can save out single frame renders if we don't want to go through the process of batch rendering. So for this particular exercise, we're just going to do single frame. This little eyeball right here will open the render view. The one next to it will open the render view and actively render. I suggest clicking the eyeball though, so we can take a look around the render view without anything in it to get an idea of how this looks. So this is Maya's Hardware 2.0 render view. And what it's going to allow us to do is create an image of our scene. Now to do so, this button at the front here is the render button. If we go and press that, it should create a render view of our scene, but it might not necessarily produce it from the camera that we're looking at. So how do we improve that, or how do we change that? In the render menu here, where it says render, you can actually change what camera is being rendered. So if we go ahead and click that and we go to render and select shot camera, it will render our shot camera. And now you'll see we'll have a beautiful image of our scene. And that is pretty much all we need to do inside of here, which is really nice. But there are some other really nice tools we can utilize. For example, we can save screenshots to do comparative renders. So let's say you wanted to tweak some settings, maybe you wanted to adjust your lights, maybe you wanted to turn on some additional features. A way you can save your current frame is with this icon right here. That looks like a JPEG. If you go ahead and click that icon, what it's going to do is it's going to create a little stored version of this that you can jump back to, and you can even save it out if you like this version better than another one. So let's click that, and you'll see what happens is I get a little slider down here. Now, let's go ahead and introduce a couple more settings to this that are render settings, which is going to be anti-aliasing and ambient occlusion. So let's go ahead and talk about those real quick. We're going to start with anti-aliasing, which is also referred to as AA, and this is one of the key features of rendering. Anti-aliasing is the process of taking an aliased line, which is the jaggedy edges you see in computer graphics, and making them look smooth. So you can think of it a bit as a smoothing effect for the entire image. And in short, anti-aliasing is generally going to be what we think of as quality. So if you take a look at these look very aliased. You can see that jaggedy edge. To do the anti-alias, all we have to do is come into our viewport here, and we can click this icon. And that will go ahead and turn on anti-aliasing. So if we go ahead and press that button, it's going to apply anti-aliasing. You might not be able to see it on my screen right now, but if I go ahead and click render, and we zoom in here, you can see that those edges look much smoother. And if I toggle between these, you can see how big of a difference that made. Notice, however, it did not affect the shadows. Unfortunately, you can't get good looking shadows inside of Hardware 2.0 easily. Usually it takes a lot of trickery. We're not going to bother with it, but if you want to come back later and re-render the scene with Arnold, feel free to. For now, we'll just look at the basics, but you can see how big of a difference anti-aliasing made there. We can have even more anti-aliasing. Let me store this one for comparison. Coming over to our render settings over here, you can click into the Hardware 2.0 tab to access its options. And if you come in here, you'll notice there's a section called Anti-Aliasing. Now, this actually affects your viewport anti-aliasing, which is really cool. And if we come in here, you can see that we can change the sample count in this drop-down menu. How high the sample count goes is dependent on your graphics card. So if you have a more powerful graphics card, you may even see higher numbers than me. If you have a weaker graphics card, you guys may not be able to push it to 16. But I could go ahead and press that to 16, and now my scene is even smoother. And if I go ahead and render this now, we can zoom in on this and compare. So this is at 16, this was at 8, this was at none. So you'll see there's a big difference between none and 8, not as big of a difference between 8 and 16. Generally speaking, at a certain point, you just get diminishing returns with render settings. So that's kind of what we're seeing here. The next thing we can add that's going to give us a nice bit of detail is going to be Ambient Occlusion. And we may not want this depending on our style, so we'll see if this one's nice or not. This is referred to as AO. If you take a look at the trees inside of my scene, you'll notice that they just kind of go from tree to shadow. So generally speaking, when we see something in the real world and it has a shadow, around the base of the shadow, we get something called a umbra, or an area where the light is completely occluded before we get into the shading of the shadow. Also, usually the base light around the object is a bit occluded. This is going to be ambient occlusion. So what ambient occlusion is essentially areas where light doesn't get to. If you take a look around any sort of standard room, so if you're in a room like I am, just a standard bedroom, and you look at the corners of the walls, you'll notice those corners have this sort of bizarre shadow, and that is ambient occlusion. We can turn ambient occlusion on here using this little dial, and that will go ahead and add in contact shadows. So let's go ahead and click that button and add in some shadows. And if I go ahead and render this now, and we compare this, you'll see that we get these nice little contact shadows to the base of our trees. And we get some overall shading to things like the hill, where it comes in contact with the ground. The trees interacting with themselves. And with the rocks, you'll see the rocks get a shadow between them as well. Now, you may or may not want this based on your style. All right, so that's something to be aware of. This is a pretty cartoony style piece, so this isn't necessarily going to make it look better. It's just going to give us an additional control that we can use. We can adjust this as well in the settings. So if you come in here to Hardware 2.0, you can come down to the section called Screen Space Ambient Occlusion, and we can do some setting adjustments here. You can play around with these to find out how they look, just to streamline the process. If you want to get the best quality, in other words, the smoothest shadows, you can set the filter radius to 32 and the samples to 32. And that's going to give you the smoothest results with this setup. And you can see how those are a little bit cleaner. I think I'm going to leave ambient occlusion off for mine. I actually think I prefer it without it. I'll keep anti-aliasing on, but that'll give us our base setup for the scene. So once you're satisfied with what you see and you're ready to save your scene out, it's as simple as coming up here to File and Save Image, and this will save your image. Now, there is something to be aware of. On the side here, you'll see there is a little toggle which says Color Manage Image right here. You want to make sure that this is checked, okay? You want to make sure that's on like mine is. Otherwise, you're going to get a raw image. So let's go ahead and save this out. I'm just going to save this as Section 2 Project Render and save. And we can go ahead and take a look at that. Notice where it's saved to, by the way. I didn't mention this, but it is saving to the images directory of the project folder. Okay, so what that means is I can hop over here to my desktop and navigate to my folder, into my images, and inside of here, we'll see my beautiful render. So there we go. That is the beautiful render of my scene. I can now take this, I could post it to a portfolio, I can post it to social media, share it on Instagram, whatever I want to do with it. Let the world know, hey, I made my first 3D project, and there you go. For some reason, ambient occlusion showed up. I think it's because I have it turned on in the render settings, if I'm not mistaken. So let's see. I didn't re-render after. There we go. So we can save over that image and be good to go. Okay, so now if we take a look at that, we'll have our beautiful image here of our scene. Okay, so I want to show one more thing before we wrap up this section, which is what happens if you don't have color manage turned on. So if you have this set to raw, this is going to be what it looks like. So just to kind of give you a comparison, let me go ahead and find the file for my desktop. This is the raw file, and it's going to be darker, is essentially what it comes down to, than the other file. All right, so this is raw over here. This is with color management applied. Talking a bit about this, this deals with gamma space. So gamma space deals with the lightness curve of an image. It's kind of complicated. For the most part, don't worry about that. But that's why we need to have the color management on. It's applying our gamma filter to give us the final result. Okay, so with that, that is going to conclude our section 2 project. Feel free to play around with the settings and beautify your image. And as a challenge, what I want you to do is produce a final rendering out of here or multiple. Feel free to try different times of day. How about you get some practice lighting, set up a night scene, set up a daytime scene, maybe set up a sunset scene, and create a rendering of each of those to create some variety. And if you want to, feel free to even experiment with moving around your camera. You can unlock it, set up different angles, and have some fun exploring rendering and producing images.